The wind dragged its fingers across the dry boards of Main Street, stirring grit into the air until the whole town seemed veiled in pale dust. Horses shifted in their hitching posts, hooves restless against the packed ground, while the church bell gave a hollow murmur as though the sound had been swallowed before reaching the hills. On the far edge of town, where the houses thinned and the prairie opened like a blank page, a small whitewashed home sat weather-beaten and steady, its porch rail carved with grooves from years of hands resting there. Inside that house, in the light of the front window, Clara sat still, her face turned toward warmth she could not see. She was 20 years old, though time had moved differently for her than for others. She remembered childhood as a series of scents and textures, moments of brightness that were taken from her long before she could hold them. Blindness had come gradual, first a haze, then shadow, then the closing of the world altogether. Now the sun was a sensation against her cheek, no more than heat, yet she positioned herself near the glass every morning as if her body still remembered longing for light. The habit was not vanity, no mirror meant anything to her. But the window gave her a sense of place, a reminder that life continued beyond her closed horizon. The room around her was small and clean, each corner memorized by touch. Her hand, pale and thin, would trace the table's edge or the back of the wooden chair to reassure herself of its permanence. She carried out her chores with measured precision, sweeping the floors with careful strokes, folding linens that never bore creases, and braiding her hair so tight that it lay like rope against her back. She spoke rarely, even to her father, not because she had nothing to say but because her words always seemed to startle those around her, as though they had forgotten she possessed a voice. Silence became her shield, and she wore it until it felt like skin. In town, her name was often spoken with that mix of pity and derision people keep for misfortune they do not wish to share. Women whispered that she was a beautiful burden, her features delicate, her skin untouched by the sun's harshness. Men said the beauty was wasted, a face unfit for marriage since her eyes, blue but unfocused, could not return a gaze. Some softened their cruelty with pity, others sharpened it into mockery. Clara never heard their full conversations, only fragments that carried through doors or along the churchyard, but the words struck deeply enough. Useless. Hopeless. Better off hidden. Each time, she pressed her lips together and walked on, pretending she was made of something harder than flesh. Her father, Henry, carried his own bitterness. Once strong from farm work, his shoulders had bent under years of strain and disappointment. He kept to his land, selling what little grain the dry soil would permit, guarding Clara from insults he could not prevent. He worried about what would become of her, though he never said it aloud. She heard it in the sighs at the end of supper, in the way he sometimes touched her shoulder with hesitation, as if trying to comfort but unable to find words. His silence was not the same as hers. It carried weight, regret, a man worn down by knowing he could not change the town's judgment or his daughter's condition. Clara's world was small, bound by familiar steps. The porch to the lilac bush, the bush to the well to the kitchen. The lilac was her secret solace. Every spring it bloomed in clusters so white that neighbors often commented on its brightness. Clara could not see it, but the fragrance told her when it flowered, rich and sweet, a breath of something alive and beautiful beyond the reach of cruelty. She would kneel beside it, brushing her fingertips over the cool leaves, pretending she could trace the shape of each blossom. To others it was just a plant. To her, it was proof that beauty could exist without being witnessed by sight. One afternoon, as she stood by the window with the light pressed against her cheek, she heard the sound of hooves slowing near the house. The steady rhythm shifted into silence, followed by the scrape of boots against dirt. She straightened, listening. Visitors were rare. Her father disliked company and most townsfolk did not bother with them except in necessity. The door opened with Henry's voice greeting someone in a cautious tone. The reply was low, firm, and unfamiliar. She turned her head toward it, her senses alert. The man who entered was James Hale, though she did not know his name then. A rancher from the southern stretch, he had a reputation for being quiet, deliberate in speech, and solitary. He had come to see Henry about trading feed. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, his boots leaving faint tracks of dust across the floorboards. Clara heard the soft thud of it placed carefully on the table rather than tossed, a gesture that caught her attention more than words. Most men, when they came, ignored her presence entirely or spoke around her as if she were furniture. This one paused, his silence weighted with intention. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice directed not at Henry but at her. The words startled Clara. She nearly shifted back in her chair. Few men addressed her first, fewer still with such plain respect. She inclined her head slightly, unsure if he expected a reply. He did not rush her, only waited as if patience was his nature. Her father cleared his throat and began speaking of supplies, prices, weather. She listened in quiet, though her attention remained caught on the stranger's presence. He did not move much, but she heard the sound of leather shifting, the faint clink of spurs. His voice, when he spoke again, carried no strain, no false cheer, simply calm steadiness. She felt something unspoken in it, a kind of ground that did not shift underfoot. When their talk of business slowed, James asked one question that drew the air tight in the room. "And your daughter, does she walk the town often?" The words were simple, but Henry stiffened. Clara's heart thudded. Such questions usually led to pity or mockery. She prepared herself for the sting. Henry replied flatly, "She keeps to the house mostly. Easier that way." Silence followed. Clara wished she could vanish into it, yet James's voice came again, directed at her with unexpected clarity. "You ever thought of seeing the ranch land?" He paused, then added with careful weight, "You'd see it different, through another's eyes." The words cut through her like sunlight breaking through heavy cloud. For a moment she could not breathe. No one had ever offered her such a vision, not in earnest. People spoke of what she lacked, what she could never have, but here was a man suggesting not what was missing but what could be shared. She turned her face toward him, lips parted, though no sound emerged. Her fingers gripped the chair's edge, grounding her trembling body. Henry gave a skeptical grunt. "She don't need charity." James did not argue. "I don't give charity," he said softly. "I offer partnership." The room seemed to still, even the ticking of the clock muffled by the weight of his words. Clara's thoughts raced in quiet chaos. Hope felt dangerous. It had betrayed her before, each time she imagined friendship or affection only to find ridicule behind it. Yet something in his tone, stripped of performance, settled into her chest like a steady flame. She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach for it, though fear clenched her tighter than any restraint. The silence stretched, and in it her heart thundered. James rose, lifted his hat from the table, and with deliberate gentleness placed his hand upon the chair near hers, not touching her, only letting the air shift with presence. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, he spoke again, "If you'll take my hand, I'll be your eyes." Her breath caught. The sentence was more than offer. It was vow, spoken without flourish, without witness, yet carrying the weight of something binding. She did not move, not yet. The moment was too large, the meaning too sharp to be answered swiftly. Her fingers twitched on the wood, aching toward his unseen gesture, yet bound by fear of stepping into hope. Henry muttered something about business and turned away, but Clara remained frozen, listening to the sound of James drawing back, boots steady, door creaking open. The cool draft that followed told her he had gone. Still, the echo of his words lingered in the room like the last toll of a bell. She sat unmoving, her heart full of questions too heavy to lift. When at last she rose, she walked slowly toward the lilac bush, the air thick with its fragrance though the blossoms had only just begun to form. She reached out, fingertips brushing leaves, grounding herself in the familiar. Yet even there, in her most private place of solace, the memory of the rancher's voice followed her. The offer was both terrifying and dazzling, a thread stretched before her into an unknown she had never dared imagine. She stood in the fading afternoon, the wind tugging gently at her braid, the scent of lilac mingling with dust, and for the first time in years she felt the fragile tremor of possibility. It did not erase the gossip or the loneliness, did not silence the cruel laughter she had carried in her heart. But it pressed against her silence with a question she could not ignore. Was she willing to risk hope again? And though she gave no answer aloud, though the prairie remained hushed and the house behind her still, Clara's hand lifted slightly into the empty air, as if already reaching for something unseen. The night after the rancher's visit stretched long, each sound in the house sharpening against the silence. Clara lay awake, fingers tracing the carved grain of the bedpost as though it could steady her wandering thoughts. The rancher's words circled her mind endlessly, an offer so simple it unsettled her. No one had ever spoken to her as if her blindness was not a weight to be borne but something he could share without shame. She tried to dismiss it as fanciful, a trick of loneliness that made his voice sound kinder than it was. Yet the memory of his calm tone, the steady pause between each word, refused to fade. She turned toward the window where moonlight must be falling, though she could not see it. She felt its faint coolness seeping through the glass, the way shadows might stretch across the floor unseen. A hollow ache stirred in her chest. To imagine stepping into a wider world, guided not by pity but by a man's patient hand, it was dangerous hope, and yet she could not help but lean toward it. Her father rose early, and she heard his boots scrape across the floorboards as he stoked the fire. When she entered the kitchen, he was already seated, mug in hand, his silence thicker than smoke. He did not speak of the visitor until halfway through their meal, his voice blunt. "That rancher," he said. "Hale, that's his name. Best you forget what he said." Clara paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice rasping from disuse. Henry shifted in his chair. "Men say things. Sometimes they mean well, sometimes they don't. Either way, it don't end kindly for a girl like you. I won't have you made a spectacle." She swallowed hard, forcing down both food and words. To argue would only deepen his worry. But inside, something small bristled against his certainty. She had spent years hearing what others thought best for her, always being sheltered from risks, hidden from the ridicule of others. Yet the offer she'd heard yesterday had not sounded like mockery. It had sounded like choice. The following days she kept to her routine, though every task felt altered. Sweeping the floor, she found her thoughts drifting to the steady cadence of the rancher's speech. Drawing water from the well, she imagined what open fields might smell like, what sounds cattle made up close, how the wind might whip across land untamed by fences. She tried to silence these thoughts, but they returned each time with sharper clarity. When James Hale came again 2 afternoons later, her father was outside mending a fence. Clara stood near the lilac bush, the blossoms faintly fragrant, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, heart hammering as the horse slowed and boots struck dirt. "Miss Clara," his voice greeted, low and unhurried. She dipped her head in acknowledgement. "You came back." "Yes," he said simply. She felt him draw nearer, though he kept a respectful distance. "I didn't wish to leave words unfinished." She breathed carefully. "Most men don't bother with unfinished words to me." "I'm not most men," he replied. No boast lay in the statement, only quiet fact. He spoke then of the ranch, describing wide pastures, the rise of hills where wind swept clean, the sound of calves calling in the dusk. His words painted pictures she could not see, yet his voice wove them into texture she could feel. The warmth of sun on skin, the creak of leather, the steady breath of animals. She found herself leaning toward him, listening not to pity but to invitation. When he paused, she hesitated, then asked, "Why tell me this?" "Because you deserve to know a life isn't closed to you," he said. "Because you've been made small by others and you aren't small." Her throat tightened. She turned her face away, ashamed of the sting in her eyes. She had wept alone often, but not before another's kindness. Silence stretched between them until he shifted closer, guiding her hand gently. He did not clutch or press, only laid something into her palm, a pair of gloves, rough leather softened by wear. She traced them with cautious fingers. "Yours?" "Yes. You'd need your own, but these are a start." Her lips parted, words caught between gratitude and fear. She handed them back, trembling. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," he said evenly. "But it's possible. If you'll trust me." The door creaked then, and Henry's voice cut across the moment. "What business you bringing my daughter into, Hale?" His tone carried suspicion sharpened by years of guarding her. James did not falter. "No business. Only an offer." Henry's boots struck hard against the ground as he approached. "She's not for pity. I won't have you play at kindness while the town laughs." "Not pity," James said, his words steady as stone. "Respect." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to speak, to defend the truth she sensed in the rancher's voice, but the weight of her father's fear pressed against her chest. She remained silent while the men exchanged clipped words, James calm, Henry gruff, until at last the rancher departed, his horse carrying him away into the settling dusk. That night Clara sat by her bed, her braid loosened, fingers trembling as they unknotted strands. Her father's caution warred with her longing. To accept James's offer would mean leaving safety, risking cruelty, perhaps even failing. But to refuse would mean surrendering to the same silence that had bound her life for years. She pressed her hands together, listening to the distant sound of crickets, and wondered if courage was something one chose or something given. The following week, whispers in town grew louder. Clara heard them as she passed the church with her father. Women spoke in hushed tones, their pity edged with scorn. "The blind girl chasing after a rancher now," one murmured. "Poor man saddled with that." Men chuckled in the saloon, voices carrying through swinging doors. "Must be desperate to court what can't even see him." The words pierced her, each one a fresh wound. Yet beneath the sting she felt something new stirring, anger not at herself but at their cruelty. She had borne silence for years, absorbing their contempt like dust settling on her skin. Now she felt the first pulse of defiance. When James came again, she met him on the porch. Her father was inside, the door left slightly ajar, but she did not falter. She stood straight, her hands steady on the railing. "You should know what they're saying," she told James, her voice firm though her heart pounded. "They laugh at you for speaking to me." "I know," he said. She frowned, startled. "And you don't care?" His silence stretched, then he answered with deliberate calm. "Their laughter feeds nothing. My work, my life doesn't bend to it. And if you stood beside me, I'd not bend either." Her breath caught, and for the first time she allowed a small, unsteady laugh. It surprised her, soft and unsure, yet it eased something tight in her chest. He had not offered her dreams, nor denied the hardship, only steadiness, a ground to stand on. Days passed, each one drawing her nearer to choice. She felt it pressing from every side, the gossip of the town, the caution of her father, the quiet certainty of the rancher. She wrestled with doubt, yet each night as she lay listening to the crickets, she found her heart leaning toward the memory of James's voice, the patience in his words, the respect in his silence. The turning came not in grand moment but in quiet resolve. She woke one morning, dressed carefully, braided her hair with deliberate care. When James arrived that afternoon, she stepped from the porch before her father could intercept, her hand extended slightly, trembling but resolute. "I will come," she said softly. James did not move at once, as though giving her chance to retract. Then, with calm certainty, he took her hand in his, steady and warm. "Then we'll walk together." Behind her, she heard her father's breath draw sharp, heavy with resistance. The town's whispers would rise louder, she knew, and fear would follow her into whatever life awaited. But in that moment, standing on the porch with her hand in James Hale's, Clara felt a current shift within. She was no longer only the girl whispered about, pitted and mocked. She was choosing, and the choice carried weight. The wind stirred the lilac bush nearby, blossoms scattering fragrance into the air. Clara lifted her chin, inhaling the sweetness, and felt the first fragile taste of freedom in her chest. The moment did not erase doubt, nor silence the world's cruelty. But it anchored her to something stronger than fear, the knowledge that she had stepped forward. And in the stillness that followed, with James's hand firm around hers, she sensed the horizon of her life opening, vast and uncertain, waiting to be walked. The ranch house stood against the horizon like a quiet sentinel, weathered boards silvered by years of wind. Clara had lived there only weeks, yet already its shape had begun to etch itself into her mind. The way the porch steps dipped slightly to one side, the sound of the kitchen window rattling when the wind pushed hard from the north, the faint smell of hay and saddle soap carried in through the doorway each evening when James returned from the fields. She moved through its spaces by touch and memory, slowly claiming the place as her own. Each stumble, each uncertain hand groping along a wall, became less humiliation than lesson. James never laughed when she faltered. He spoke little, but his silence was never sharp. When she brushed against a chair or lost her way across the room, he guided her with a light touch at her elbow, nothing more. Often he said nothing at all, simply waited until she steadied herself. It was not the silence of pity but of patience, and from that patience she drew the strength to keep learning. The land itself was vast, and though she could not see it, she came to know it through his words and through her own senses. He led her to the pasture fence and let her run her hand along the rough wood warmed by sun. He guided her fingers to the muzzle of a horse, the soft breath huffing against her palm, the coarse whiskers tickling her skin. He placed her hand on the flank of a cow, solid and warm, so she might understand the size and life that filled the herd. Each act was small, unadorned, yet each opened a space within her that had long been closed. One morning he brought her a young calf only days old, its body trembling with newness. He pressed her hand gently to its hide, still slick in places from birth. The calf's small heart beat against her palm, fast and uncertain. Clara felt a sudden rush of tenderness so strong it startled her. She laughed softly, her first true laugh in years, the sound carrying across the yard like something fragile and new. James said nothing, but she sensed his stillness beside her, as though he understood the moment was larger than words. At night, after supper, they sat together on the porch. She listened to the crickets and the far-off lowing of cattle, the wood creaking under their chairs. Sometimes his hand rested near hers on the railing, not quite touching, but close enough that the warmth reached her. These silences comforted her more than conversation ever could. They were not empty, they brimmed with unspoken acknowledgement, the quiet building of trust. Yet the outside world did not forget her. Whispers trailed them whenever they went into town. Clara heard the laughter at the mercantile, the smirks behind church pews. The blind girl leading the rancher by the hand. Some muttered. Others sneered. What use is she to him? He must be lonely beyond sense. Each word pressed against her ribs like a stone. But for the first time in her life she did not shrink from the pain. Instead, she held her head higher, not because she was fearless, but because James walked beside her without wavering. His steadiness gave her spine, and she clung to it quietly. Still, fear lingered. She wondered if his patience would wear thin, if the weight of ridicule would break him as it had broken so many others. One evening, while they cleared dishes, she whispered the question that had haunted her since she first placed her hand in his. Why me? James did not answer at once. She heard him set a plate gently on the counter, then the scrape of a chair pulled back. He came closer, his boots steady. Because you don't hide from truth, he said finally. Most do. You can't. You live it. And that's strength. Her throat tightened, but she nodded, the words sinking deep where no gossip could reach. The threat came one dry evening in late summer. Dust hung in the air, and the cattle lowed restless in the fields. Clara stood on the porch, listening to the creak of saddle leather and the drunken laughter of approaching riders. Hooves struck hard against packed earth, a careless, swaggering rhythm. James stepped out from the barn, his posture alert though his voice calm when he called to them. There were 3 men, their words slurred by whiskey and malice. Hail, one jeered, we hear you took yourself a wife who can't see the nose on her face. The others laughed cruelly, spitting into the dust. You marry her out of charity? Or was no other woman foolish enough to have you? Clara's hands clenched against the railing, her body rigid. She felt the sting of every word, sharper because it was spoken not behind her back but hurled directly toward her. The men's laughter cut into the air, raw and brutal. James did not flinch. His voice was measured, almost too calm. You've said your piece. Now ride on. But the men were not content to leave. One dismounted with a heavy thud, his boots crunching across the yard. Clara heard his steps drawing closer, the stink of alcohol sharp even from a distance. Let's see this prize of yours, he sneered. She felt his presence approaching the porch, the malicious intent in his voice like a blow. Her heart hammered. Fear rooted her in place. For a moment, the old silence threatened to claim her again, the silence that had shielded her for years, the silence that had made her invisible. But something stronger rose up within her, the memory of James's words, the steadiness of his hand, the fragile dignity she had begun to claim. When the man's boots struck the porch steps, she stepped forward before she could lose courage. Her body trembled, but her voice rang clear, stronger than she thought possible. You call me blind, she said, each word deliberate, but I see more than you ever will. The air stilled. Even the crickets seemed to pause. The drunkard halted, his breath ragged, surprised into silence. The other 2 muttered uneasily, their laughter faltering. James stood behind her, his stillness heavy as iron, his gaze fixed on them with cold warning. Clara raised her chin, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. You see only weakness. But I have lived every day with what you fear most, darkness. And still I stand. That's more sight than your eyes have ever given you. The man swore under his breath, but his bravado crumbled. He stumbled back a step, muttering curses that no longer carried force. His companions called to him, their mockery hollow now, and within moments the 3 of them mounted up and rode away, their laughter fading thin against the wind. Silence settled again, deep and ringing. Clara stood frozen, her breath sharp in her chest. Then she felt James's hand steady against hers, not pulling, not restraining, only resting firm and sure. She turned slightly toward him, sensing his gaze though she could not see it. His silence told her everything, pride, respect, and the kind of unshaken trust she had longed for all her life. They returned to the porch together, sitting side by side as the evening deepened. Clara's heart still pounded, but beneath the tremor lay a profound calm. She had spoken not for him alone but for herself. For years she had been the subject of whispers, the object of pity or scorn, voiceless under the weight of others' judgments. Tonight she had broken that silence. The scent of lilac drifted on the air, faint but steady, carried from the bush she had planted by the house weeks earlier. She reached toward it, her fingers brushing the leaves, the blossoms cool beneath her touch. She smiled faintly, the fragrance filling her with a sense of belonging. She could not see the flowers, but she no longer needed to. They were hers, rooted in soil she now called home. James's hand remained near hers, not gripping, not pressing, only present. She shifted slightly until her fingers brushed his, and he closed them gently around hers. No words passed between them, yet the gesture carried the weight of a vow. The stars wheeled unseen above, The prairie stretched silent around them, and Clara felt the world widen. She had not been given sight, but she had been given something more enduring, the power to be seen, wholly and without shame. The silence between her and James brimmed with unspoken promise, a bond forged not in pity or in need but in respect and choice. For the first time the darkness did not feel like a prison. It felt like a place from which she could still look outward, not with eyes but with courage. She leaned into the night, inhaling the fragrance of lilac and dust, and allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. The world had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to keep her small. But tonight she had answered it. And in the answering she had claimed her life.